Let's move on to the inductive approach, which is quite contrary to deductive approach we mentioned previously. It's a rule discovery path where students are asked to discover language or grammar rules after going through some exercise of a text or of examples presented by the teacher. In a normal inductive approach classroom, a teacher exposes students to certain examples instead of putting them or exposing them to rules straight away. And after knowing the examples, students are asked to work with those examples and find a rule. That's why we call it a rule discovery path. In this way, it becomes more learning and learner-centered in many ways. The major intent in inductive approach is to make students notice how a certain rule works in language and then try to figure out how possibly they could use that in their own language learning. A teacher in an ideal inductive approach classroom would expose students to a variety of examples related to rule. It may not be, the examples may not be restricted to certain set of language use. Rather, the teacher would pick examples from various areas for a given rule or concept, and then he would expect that students notice the use of a particular rule of the language in those various extracts or the uses of language. As a conclusion of the activity based on inductive approach, teacher could have a final check and see the rule which students have figured out is correct or not. And overall, we could say that it's an upward process of thinking where students look into some general uses of the language through examples, and then they formulate the principles or rules on which those uses or examples are based on. If we look at the picture in front of us, there is a brief difference between both deductive and inductive approaches. We can see that a deductive approach overtly explains the rule first and then provides specific examples to reinforce it. Inductive approach, on the other hand, provides specific examples first about the use of that language or grammar rule, and then asks students to infer or deduce the rule from those examples. There could be certain advantages of an inductive approach. It provides students new knowledge of language and its uses and helps them in discovering new information or knowledge about language. It also provides them first-hand information by their own experience and observation, and makes students learn or discover various rules which could, ideally speaking, could fit in their existing mental storage of knowledge quite easily as compared to the other forms of teaching. Then it makes language rules more memorable and serviceable for the students. The kind of cognitive efforts or mental efforts involved in this in the process of learning, we could assume that there is more cognitive depth on the part of students involved in this type of discovery. So they might be trained to organize their knowledge in their mental storehouses as well. And in this way, we could also expect that their mind would be trained, and in this way they can develop their self-confidence and the ability to initiate. It's primarily an activity-oriented approach in which students are actively engaged in various activities during the classroom, and in this way they may become more attentive and motivated in the learning process. It also focuses on students' problem-solving activities and abilities, and if these abilities are done or worked on collaboratively, students are asked to work in groups in a collaborative fashion, students may get extra opportunities to practice their language, because when they would share their experience with each other, they would get extra appreciation and chances of rehearsing those rules time and again. In this way, when students work for rules themselves, we can assume that this approach focuses more on learner autonomy. There could be certain disadvantages of inductive approach if not followed properly. An activity or learning based on inductive approach may become slow, because it takes a lot of time to work out rules in a language classroom, and the time spent on working out rules based on the examples presented to the students is usually at the expense of the time which could possibly be spent on the exercise or practice of those rules, as we do in deductive approach. In the end, we have a possibility that students might hypothesize a wrong rule. They are given an example or a variety of examples, and based on those examples, the rule they derive may be wrong. So, teachers need to be very careful, and they should have a final check on students in order to find out that, or ensure that the students derive the right rule. Overall, this approach puts heavy demands on teachers as well in terms of their lesson planning, because teachers must be careful and organize materials which may help students practicing rules properly, and that they must choose examples which would lead students to the identification and practice of rules of grammar in a proper way. And they should avoid those ambiguous practices or examples which may mislead the students. It also has a shortcoming that some language areas or language rules may not be easily identifiable, or they might resist an easy rule formulation. For example, aspect and modality are those areas of language grammar or language use which have a variety of rules, and young students in a typical ELT classroom may find it difficult to identify rules, particular rules, by looking into their uses in general language use. So teachers must be extra cautious when they are introducing such aspects of language use in ELT classrooms. And this approach might also frustrate those students who are used to learn language in a typical way, and that is they expect their teachers to tell them the rules and make them practice those rules. So this approach may be challenging for such students. So before introducing such approach in their classrooms, an ELT practitioner and teacher must be cautious about the previous background of their learners, because this approach may become challenging, as I said a while ago, for those learners who are quite used to the traditional ways of learning.